This is an epilogue to the 4 short talks on the subject in Lacan. It is, as it were, a sequel to the subject. And I was motivated to do this for 2 reasons. Number 1, I had mentioned before in passing something about the idea of reflexivity. Reflexivity, being self-reflexive, certainly within the discipline of psychology, within trainings in psychotherapy, counseling, is always treated as a kind of virtue. This is in fact almost a criteria for good practice. We must be self-reflexive, we must be self-critical, we must be able to interrogate various of our own assumptions. Now, I think that's kind of useful as a point of comparison, because as we've explored the subject, or the notion of the subject in Lacan, the subject as split, you can see that this idea contrasts very radically with the ideals of something like self-reflexivity. Reflexivity reversed, maybe that's one way that of thinking what the subject in Lacan is. I've noted here that by definition the subject in Lacan is the disparity, the mismatch, the not adding up. Those splits, those ruptures, as in the examples I gave, the Zizek examples of the guy who sees his own car getting towed away and thinks it's someone else's and laughs until he realizes it's that himself. And of course, the multiple different forms of splittedness that we see in Lacanian theory, in each of those instances, we see a playing out of a rupture, the exact opposite, the inverse, the reversal of any form of reflexivity. So the discourse of reflexivity is one which always wants to push us towards some kind of imaginary coherence, some imaginary integration. It's as if we're able to say that with this notion of reflexivity, I can take myself and look upon it. I can take myself and interrogate it, ask questions and learn from it. But the very prefix of self-reflexivity tells us something. It tells us that this is a practice which is underscored by the agenda of reconcilability. It's a kind of imaginary practice which always foregrounds the self as that engine, that potentiality of some kind of integration, harmonious self, a kind of transparent self that can be integrated and made whole. The notion of the subject in Lacan does exactly the opposite. Whereas the discourse of self-reflexivity ultimately aims at a kind of imaginary coherence, imaginary integration, you could say that the notion of the subject in Lacan stresses the very splitness, the very real conditions, the non-reconcilability of the subject. And hence we can come back to this quote that we introduced earlier. The Lacanian subject names a gap in the symbolic, and I suppose the point I really want to emphasize here is most importantly that its status is real, that it is exactly the fact of non-reconcilability. So that's the first point that motivated me to want to do an epilogue, just to be able to put a Lacanian concept into play, into opposition with something which is often a fairly unquestioned ideal within psychological discourse and psychological trainings, namely the notion of reflexivity. I've also added here that if we adequately get a grasp of the priority of grasping subject as split, almost split as subject is probably a better way of putting it, subject as split, split as subject, if we grasp the importance of this as a crucial Lacanian motif and understanding, suddenly a whole series of Lacanian clinical techniques follow on and start to make sense, because these are Lacanian clinical techniques which, if anything, help exacerbate the split, help us in the realization of subject as split. And some of them are the variable session, the idea that one might punctuate the session or indeed the speech of the analysand, the idea of scansion, types of suspension. In each case, we have a kind of reflexivity undone, reflexivity thwarted. And the point here is just to say that those clinical techniques, those clinical ideas, which are deserving of a series of lectures all in their own right, follow on precisely from the prioritization of subject as split, the subject as incommensurate unto itself, the subject as somehow fractured, the subject as not being able to come together. Also, just to respond to some of the questions that I've got on the first couple of lectures, You'll remember that right from the first session, I was talking about the realization of the subject. So some questions have come in and saying, well, where's agency in this? And I suppose what I would have to say is that it is precisely by attending to subject as split, those incommensurabilities, those non-harmonious elements of non-integration, that is the subject, and those non-integratables, those non-integrations occur at multiple different levels. I'll make that point as we move on. But by attending to subject as split, one is avoiding the stasis of the imaginary agenda of creating a harmonized and maintaining a harmonized whole. You could then say that for every schism, every split, every non-commensurability, every mode where something is not working, something shows itself as being a non-harmony, in each of those moments, there is a possibility of a shift, of engendering something new. So just to make the point, I would say that the entirety of the concept of the subject in Lacanian theory and the notion which goes with it of realization of the subject within clinical practice, whether it's through these ideas or whether through the whole narrative that we've been trying to develop, is it's very much about the realization, about a shifting, about the possibility of something new emerging, which you could say is exactly what these clinical techniques are trying to do. So, first part of the talk done. The second part of the talk was that I felt a little bit less than satisfied after the conclusion of our 4 mini lectures. And I felt that after making all this emphasis on subject as split, particularly in respect of this quote of Zizek, that I wanted to add something. I felt like, well, maybe we need to add a little bit more intellectual content because it sounded a bit too fragmentary. And of course, at this point, you could go, Derek, you are missing the whole point of the notion of the subject, because if you felt the need to make another talk to repair it for us, to make it more understandable, more cohesive, you're essentially trying to imaginarize a concept which is precisely there to foreground that the subject is not a whole, a harmonized, singular entity. But here, having said that, let me try nonetheless. Here's the quote. I used it more than once before. It is in Less Than Nothing, and Zizek offers the following. The subject is not just thwarted, is not just blocked or impeded or stigmatized by a constitutive impossibility. The subject is the result of its own failure, of the failure of its symbolic representation. As subject endeavors to express itself in a signifier, it fails, and the subject is this failure. Now you can see why I was left thinking I need to add something here, problematic as that may be, but you see there seems to be some kind of doubleness of temporality here. On the one hand, we've got the subject attempting to speak, the subject creating some kind of engendering of failure within language, and here we have subject as act, but somehow the subject is produced at the same time. So you will have picked that up. A subject, to go back to Zizek, a subject endeavors to express itself in a signifier, which seems to imply that there already is a subject. It fails to do so, and the subject is this failure. So there seems to be a kind of circularity here, which is frustrating me. On the one hand, we've got the subject who exists to speak, who makes the error, whose speech doesn't work, and therefore one produces a subject. Now, of course, one way of trying to kind of reconcile this disparity is to say, well, where do you jump in? Where do you start this account? And maybe the kind of trick, the kind of important point that's often made in Lacanian theory, one's got to do have a sense of the retroactive effect of the subject. So by the moment when there is a subject who tries to speak and fails and thus creates the subject, that seeming speaking subject is already perhaps the after effect of an earlier attempt to speak, right? So you could say that. But I wanted to add a few comments on this. The first is the self-critical moment of saying, Derek, you don't need to reconcile this apparent disparity. The fact that there's a two-ness, there's a duplicity almost in this way of describing the subject. The subject who speaks and thus creates a speech error, which somehow is the subject who was already speaking. So the first point is, chill out. Haven't you been listening? You don't need to reconcile this. The whole point is that the subject is irreconcilability. The point of subject as split is that disjuncture, disparity, is what the subject is as non-reconcilable. And I just wanted to note here, there's multiple domains in which we could trace this splitness, this non-commensurability, this non-reconcilability of the subject. The one, statement and enunciation, the content of the message as delivered as opposed to how it's delivered and how it is heard. Okay, statement and enunciation never match up. The other, which is a big theme, particularly in seminar 11 for Lacan, is this the fact that between meaning and being, a state of being, and the attempt to facilitate through signifiers some meaning and understanding, those two things are never themselves commensurate. Human subject seems to battle to try and bring these things together. And also, the disjuncture or disparity can be noted at the level of time. Hence the city theatre example. The guy goes off, goes to the bathroom, comes back and sits down, and his friend says, oh, you just saw that person who was peeing or whatever. So there's often these disjunctions, both in temporality and in terms of the relationship or non-relationship between meaning and being, and between statement and enunciation. And our one conclusion is just to say, Derek, the very frustration you feel about not being able to reconcile this stuff is the point. So we got that. But of course, I'm going to try and say something nevertheless. And I do think that even in terms of the philosophical logic of how Zizek is expressing things here, there is some room to do this. Back to the question. How is the subject, both the person, the thing, not person, both the event, the potentiality, and back to, just while we're on the point, where's agency here? Think always, when we're thinking about the subject in Lacan, as speech event, as speech enactment, as symbolic utterance. Something is happening. That's the agency of the subject. But coming back to my question, how is the subject that speaks, that tries to speak, that fails in speaking, and thus produces the subject? How do we try to make sense of these two times, these two different sites of the subject? And I suppose my one way of responding to that is to say, well, we could think the subject at two levels. We could distinguish between the subject as approached on the ontological level. The subject as approached on the ontological level precisely as ontological undecidability. We could think the subject at the level of ontology as ontological undecidability. Indeed, precisely as non-substantiality, as void, as emptiness. But we can also think the subject as speech event, that is, at the active level of speech activated, at the moment of speaking, at that pulse, that spark that occurs when the disjunction is drawn, is made most overt. Now, if we do that, and let's just play that out again, we can think the subject at the ontological level precisely as ontological undecidability, void, emptiness, as well as thinking the subject at the active level of speech activated. If we try to do that, that gives us a sense of how the subject might be, as we could put it, undecidability pronounced, undecidability trying to speak, or failure reiterated, underscoring the undecidability that the subject already was. In other words, failure trying to substantialize, to ontologize itself, to become whole, a definitive entity, which gets stuck in a kind of repetitive pattern, or even if it's not exactly a repetitive pattern, the after effect of the failed attempt to speak is engendering of a subject that will speak again. That's another way of trying to give this more of a kind of temporal dynamism. So just to make that point, it's kind of useful then to think about the subject not merely as void, as ontological undecidability, but the ontological undecidability that emerges within the symbolic movement momentum of speaking to create a failure which underscores once again the undecidability that the subject is and that the subject already was. Let us then have our conclusion. One of the questions that I received on the YouTube channel talks on the subject was, where do we fit object A? This is kind of crucial, and unfortunately it's going to mean we need a whole bunch of new talks, because we've said a bunch of things. We've related the subject to speech. We've related the subject to splitness, to undecidability. We've thought about the subject in relationship to structure. We've thought the subject in Lacan in philosophical terms. We've made a number of moves which I think have been quite important to prioritize how realization, the speech event, is a kind of agency implicit within any moment of the subject. We've done a whole lot of that stuff. But as Lacan moves on in his teaching, object A, this evasive object cause of desire, becomes crucially important in how he goes on to develop his teaching. And not only does it become crucially important in how he develops his teaching and how he wants to understand his own contribution to psychoanalysis, object A becomes really crucial in how we would even think the subject. So just to give you a taster of a series of theoretical moves that we may go on to make, let's now think in very provisional terms, just briefly, how we might go about thinking about the relationship of subject to object. And the nice phrase that Slavoj Žižek uses in many different contexts, one of which I'll cite now from his book Absolute Recoil, is he thinks about object A, this evasive, je ne sais quoi, difficult to grasp, object cause of desire, as the objectal counterpart of the subject. In other words, as Lacan's teaching develops, there is no subject without this elusive object A. So two quotes just to underline this further trajectory where we would need to go if we were going to have a somehow satisfying, or should we say non-satisfying, frustrating, but nevertheless theoretically developed notion of the subject. So I am going to read two brief quotes. This is from page 359 from Absolute Recoil. Lacan's thesis is that there are objects because there is a split subject. This constitutive split of the subject is the split between the void that is the subject and the impossible real objectal counterpart of the subject, the purely virtual object A. So what one starts to happen here is that we see once this crucial motif of the split, of the non-reconcilability, indeed of the real, is deployed. We see it occurring within the subject, but we see it also, as it were, enfolded within the subject in its relationship to objects. So this motif, this splitness, this real that qualifies the subject, we've already seen that it also qualifies the big other, starts to become a very frequently used and important concept that runs through Lacan's particularly later work. But two moments are worthwhile emphasizing here. Lacan's thesis is that there are objects because there is a split subject. So let's just dwell on that. There would not be objects, presumably here psychical objects, objects of desire, objects of fantasy. There would not be objects were there not a subject. And of course, by which we mean the split subject. There would not be objects without a split subject. And the impossible real objectal counterpart of the subject is object A. So for there even to be a subject, there needs to be this objectal counterpart. There needs to be, if there is a subject, there is a constitutive lack, a constitutive absence, a subtracted element that is the object A, which is what, as it were, keeps subject in motion, we could say. Two more quotes. We're moving to page 140 of Absolute Recoil, where he makes a similar point in slightly more straightforward terms. The subject, says Slavoj Žižek, cannot be without the object A as its objectal support. Kind of like that. You need an objectal support. The fragmentation, the disparity that is the subject doesn't work without some kind of minimal objectal support. The negativity of the subject, the negativity that is the subject, is sustained by its impossible object, the objectal counterpart. There is no subject without the object. As Lacan argues in Encore, the reciprocity between the subject and object A is total. So we're not going to elaborate much more, but just to leave us with this puzzling notion, this puzzling psychoanalytic idea that it is only because there is a subtracted, a kind of constitutive lost element, facet of this subject. It is only because there is this object cause of desire that there is the subject. Something has been taken out, something is perceived to have been extracted, And whatever it is that we call the subject is constantly in pursuit of this missing object, which is here's the phrase, the objectal counterpart, the corollary missing piece, the corollary absence that is what underlies the facet of there being a subject at all.